Welcome to my Bangkok studio. Not quite 4 years ago, I began hand push engraving. And in fact, I was using these two gravers right here. Now, if you compare these with some newer gravers that I got when I was at New Approach this past year, then don't worry, I'll be talking about that in later episodes as well. You deserve to hear something about why I've been in the dark ages this past year. But this graver that I got at New Approach compared to this one that I started out with, well, let's just say we've come a long way. So when I first started out engraving, I was using copper practice plates, and I still use copper practice plates to this day. But I was posting those on social media, back when I was active on social media, and I got a lot of questions. And today what I'm going to do is answer those questions that I got back then. I'm going to answer the questions about what I'm doing now, and then we're going to look at the new questions that come up, because every time you get answers, new questions come around, don't they? So to start at the beginning, what is engraving? Engraving is taking a very small, effectively a knife. This is what we call a graver. I am an engraver. This is a graver. Why? Probably historical convention, but that's what it is. And in the European style, there's basically two styles of engraving that reach back through history. There's hand push engraving, where all of the effort comes from the weight of your hand. And then there's hammer and chisel engraving, which has a chisel, which is much like a larger graver, and then a hammer. And that's often used on bigger objects like shotguns or armor. Because yes, engraving is very old. But it also continues to modernize. So now we also have laser engraving. One of the biggest questions that people asked me when they saw my struggling attempts to try and become something less than a worm at engraving was, why would you mess around with that? Why would you take the effort to learn hand engraving when you could just do laser engraving? It's easy. And the answer is this. I like traditional stuff, and then also beyond that, there's a huge difference between what we call bright cut engraving, which is when you use a metal tool and it leaves a bright finish. If this graver is polished properly, it both cuts better and leaves a brighter mark. Whereas a laser, if you look at this inscription on the inside of a ring that I had laser engraved here in Bangkok, laser engraving just burns a trough in the metal. So rather than leaving a smooth finish that is also angular and will channel the light, laser engraving just leaves a trough. So when the light goes into it, it just goes, non-reflective. And even the better samples of laser engraving that I've seen, while they do create attractive patterns, they do not channel light in the way that bright cut engraving does. So without getting into all of the different styles, because we'll start to adventure into that in other shorter videos, so if you haven't subscribed, make sure you do that now so that you can actually see those patterns and something about how they're designed. But the long and short of it is I appreciate the tradition that came before, as well as the difference in the effect that it can create in jewelry. And as to why would I want to do that? Aside from just appreciating it, the less people do things, the more rare they are, and therefore the more valuable. So while I get a kick out of being able to do something that other people can't do, there is still a commercial aspect to it. Because if a large amount of the old masters are, kicking it, and I'm left over, well, sounds like my client base is growing, as long as we do a good job. So how does it work? Basically, with hand push engraving, you take your graver, you sharpen it properly. And this is the thing that often takes beginning engravers years to actually figure out. I went through that pilgrim's progress. And yes, it is the refiner's fire. The changes are so minute that you don't know that you're doing something wrong until you find out that the graver just doesn't work. We always have to go back to a practice plate, hopefully, and test our work, see if it's actually cutting properly. Then what we do is we position the graver into the metal at a steeper angle and slowly lower our hands until the graver starts to cut only with the weight of our hand. If you haven't sharpened it properly, it's not going to move. Or it's just going to fly out. And let me just say I've had a lot of near misses, thank the Lord, because if they wouldn't have been misses, it would have been in my hand. And I prefer to stay out of the hospital and unmaimed. And because we went through the process of polishing it, the polished finish that's on this steel is left behind in whatever metal we're cutting. With ornamental hand engraving, such as you learn in Jason Marchiafaba's course, the same one that I began with almost 4 years ago, all of these patterns are meant to be done in precious metals. I've cut a lot of copper, which I wouldn't call precious metal, but it is pleasant to cut. Then you've got silver, gold, and platinum. And one of the most interesting things to me is that when you personally go and use a hand graver on each of those different metals, you get to know those metals more intimately, because each of them cuts in a different way. They feel different. When I was originally engraving this loop, which you can see my engraving has matured greatly since that time, These outer scales are made out of aluminum, and this basically crunches and then slips. Brass, such as this gauge right here, I got ridiculous and started putting scrolls on the back side of it. Because who doesn't like more personalized tools? But brass cuts like soap. It just slides, which is terrifying and really frustrating when you've spent all of the time working on all of these other motifs around an area, and then you slide and the graver goes right through everything. File it off, start again. But despite those years of trial, I have to say that now, almost 4 years later, the amount of satisfaction that I get from being able to make and be a part of bringing a piece of treasure to life is absolutely humbling. And I don't want to do much else. I'll go into greater depth about these rings later, but I was given a 10-carat class ring, absolute abomination of a thing, and my client wanted to melt that down and turn it into 2 separate rings as gifts, and so I did, and I was very glad to be able to melt it down. Then I completely hand fabricated, starting just from this molten ring, and behold, because of the years that I spent engraving, I was able to make something that nobody else has ever been able to wear. And frankly, not many people now can replicate it, even if my engraving skills are still on the way up. And I'm humbled by the skills of so many other engravers around me, usually on the internet, not so many nearby. The fact that I was able to make these rings because of the knowledge that I gained over that time, and then also the time that I spent at New Approach in Tennessee working on goldsmithing and stone setting. To think that from when I started at Gemstones and Jewelry, about a half a decade ago, and to be able to be here now, well, that really scratches the itch, let me just say. So if you, like me, appreciate engraving and the traditional art forms, which are not replaced by laser engraving, then I'd suggest that you head over to gemshepherd.com, sign up for my newsletter, because I will be releasing the pieces that I finish there before any of the general public gets to see them. Some of those styles will be available in the shop, and other things will be exclusive to the mail list. So make sure you sign up for it if you're interested in those things. We're approaching Christmas after all. Perhaps something that's unique, one of a kind, might actually be up your alley. Otherwise, leave me a comment down below, hit like, hit subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.